From the American Neurological Association, I'm Adeline Goss. This is ANA Investigates. Today, we'll explore emerging strategies to enhance recovery after stroke. Stroke rehabilitation has long relied on physical, occupational, and speech therapy, but advances in neuroscience are opening new opportunities to directly modulate brain networks, promote plasticity, and hopefully help patients regain function. Dr. Sean Dukelow's work focuses on neurorehabilitation and the mechanisms of recovery after stroke. He's a professor and head of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation in the Department of Clinical Neurosciences at the University of Calgary. Dr. Dukelow was interviewed by Dr. Cheran Elangovan, vascular neurologist at University of Tennessee Health Science Center. Here's Cheran.
Welcome, Sean. It's wonderful to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
To get us started, in your opinion, what do you think are the most exciting developments that has happened in stroke rehab in the past decade?
So, stroke rehabilitation, right now, I think is probably the new frontier for stroke research because we've done a lot in terms of endovascular treatment and breaking up clots over the last 30 years. But what we need to work on significantly is how to rewire the brain and have patients who are disabled by stroke recover that disability beyond the first 24 hours. And so a lot of the developments in stroke rehab have focused on this sort of rewiring aspect of things. So you have things like non-invasive brain stimulation, or in some cases invasive brain stimulation, like transcranial magnetic stimulation, transcranial direct current stimulation. You have brain-computer interfaces, which take the form of an EEG cap that reads electrical signals from the brain and controls a robot that can move a limb, to robotics, which can be used either to deliver therapy, so patients can get access to high-intensity, repetitious movement, which we know can help improve recovery after a stroke, to things like virtual reality, where we can put someone in an environment where they may have to go back to work without actually having to put them back to work, and help retrain them for a position or their participation in home or in the community, to things like wearables, because one of the things that we're always interested in rehab is a patient doing homework that's assigned by the therapist? How much are they doing? Because we know how much repetition can influence neuroplasticity in the brain, and wearables can begin to allow us to do that. And then there's been sort of a renewed interest over the past couple of years of drugs and how they might influence neuroplasticity. And in my group right now, in our cancer recovery trials group, we're running a drug trial on the drug Merz, which we think might actually improve motor recovery.
It's definitely an exciting time in rehab. I know you mentioned transcranial magnetic stimulation as one of the promising options that's coming up. I'm curious if you could explain a little more about how TMS works, especially for our audience who may not be familiar with it, and how we are ultimately hoping to use it for stroke recovery.
So TMS, or transcranial magnetic stimulation, it's an electromagnet that we apply over the surface of the scalp in most cases. When we turn the magnet on, it causes a very focused area of depolarization in the brain. Most TMS coils that are used clinically now will focus to about 1 cubic centimeter. The technology is clinically approved for use in depression and some other psychiatric disorders. But in stroke, we're seeing it used in a variety of different approaches experimentally. The first is interesting in that if you give a single pulse of electrical activity, you can test whether the corticospinal tracts are intact. And there's some suggestion that this can be a really good biomarker of what someone's motor recovery is going to look like after a stroke. By measuring the motor evoked potential, so the electrical activity in the hand or in the wrist, when you're stimulating over motor cortex after someone's had a stroke on the side of the brain that's been affected by the stroke. And if there's presence of a motor evoked potential in those muscles, it's usually a good prognostic indicator because it means that the circuit is intact and that patient's likely to have good recovery of, let's say, the upper extremity. Now, the other side of TMS is repetitive TMS, where you apply repetitive pulses of TMS, so you cause repetitive depolarizations. And the thinking is that the frequency of stimulation that you apply causes either inhibition of a brain area or excitation of a brain area. And so the impact of either inhibiting or exciting an area of the brain can last for several minutes after you've completed these repeated magnetic stimulations of the brain. And so in rehab, what's happening is you're seeing a number of trials that are coupling brain stimulation of a given area with some sort of rehabilitation therapy. It could be therapy for aphasia, it could be therapy for motor recovery of the upper or lower extremity, it could be for spatial neglect. And so the patient sits in a chair, they receive their repetitive TMS, and then immediately go off and do therapy, working with a therapist or a device for the next 45 minutes or an hour. And the thought is that the brain is effectively primed to be better to rewire after they complete their treatment. And so that's the basic concept of RTMS in stroke.
And I know you had a recent publication in neurology where you used RTMS to help recovery in aphasia. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I mean, one of the challenges that I face clinically is I see a number of patients who come through who have pretty significant expressive aphasia or non-fluent aphasia. And so I was approached by our group of speech language pathologists to see if we could do something to help out with it. And this is about 10 years ago when we started down this road. And so they came and said they'd heard about a new technology, repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation, and they wondered about us using it. And so we looked at what happens in the brain after someone has a left hemisphere stroke and they develop expressive aphasia. And over time, if you follow patients and you do functional MRI in them, and you have them do things like naming while they're in a functional MRI and you're looking at blood flow changes, you find that many of them will remap their expressive language over into the right hemisphere, particularly into an area of the brain called the pars triangularis, which is the right homologue of Broca's area. And so we sat as a study group and looked at a few case series that were out there where they tried to use RTMS to inhibit this pars triangularis on the right side of the brain. And there was some preliminary findings in these case series that suggested this actually might lead to better language outcomes. And so we paired RTMS with a newer type of speech language therapy, which is called multimodal aphasia therapy, which was high intensity speech language therapy delivered in more than just talking. So there's written and gestural communication that's included with it. The study looked at randomizing patients into getting either RTMS followed by 3 hours a day of this multimodal aphasia therapy for 10 days versus a sham of RTMS. So a magnetic coil that looks and sounds like the RTMS coil, but doesn't actually deliver any magnetism or any of the stimulation of the brain, plus that same multimodal aphasia therapy. We did this over the course of 10 days. And we did neuroimaging and a number of language measures before the 10 days and after the 10 days. And again, at 3 months after the patients had been enrolled in the study. And what we found is the patients had a substantial improvement on the Western Aphasia Battery, which is a measure of language function in the group that received the RTMS, substantially more than the group that had only received the multimodal aphasia therapy.
That's very exciting and hopeful. And if I'm right, this study used the inhibitory effects of RTM to inhibit the non-dominant side.
Yes, it did. Yeah. And so, you can look at the brain and actually see, do they remap over onto left hemisphere again? And our preliminary look suggests that's the case.
Gotcha. Excellent. And, to think of treatment strategies based on it, I'm curious, when would you consider this treatment for patients, or, what type of patients would you think are good candidates for this type of treatment?
Well, so we did this study in chronic stroke, and that was largely just because the pandemic interrupted the study. And so we had difficulty getting approvals to put our inpatients through this therapy at the time we conducted the study. There's other studies out there that would suggest that patients who are earlier after their stroke, so subacute, some of those in inpatient rehab with non-fluent aphasia would also benefit from this type or similar therapy. There's a trial called the North Star trial, which was led by Alex Steele, that made some suggestions to that as well. And so I think ultimately we probably need a larger trial to be definitive about these things, because our trial was less than 50 patients. But it's exciting because it's a signal, right? And I watched patients who came through who hardly had any speech production before they started the trial. And at the end, one of them did a television interview with me. And so it's heartening to see such a profound improvement in some of the patients who came through the trial.
Absolutely. As we know, stroke can affect different people differently. Motor, speech, swallowing problems, neglects, ambulation. Do you think this has a broader application to other deficits as well?
Yeah, most certainly. I mean, there are a large number of small trials that have been conducted or are currently being conducted looking at a range of things, from spasticity to hemispatial neglect to upper extremity motor function, which is a very common one, to walking. Currently in Canada, we're just finishing up a trial called ContraStroke, which is led out of Montreal by Alex Theo and Ottawa by Jody Edwards, where we're looking at upper extremity motor recovery in inpatients using RTMS. But it's one of many, many studies that are out there. And, if you look across the studies, again, there seems to be a signal there that this is actually making a difference. So it's an exciting time to be doing this sort of thing.
Absolutely. And in terms of time scale for effectiveness, you mentioned that in your study, you studied patients who had chronic stroke and post-stroke aphasia. Is there an indication that an earlier intervention could be even more effective?
Well, I think many of us would think that. I've done some recent work with Bob Teasel, who's out of London, Ontario, and he's combing the literature, looking at early versus late interventions. And one of the figures that he will talk about is that it requires about 3 times the amount of therapy in someone with chronic stroke with an upper extremity therapy to get a similar gain on typical upper extremity outcome measures than if you're in the subacute period. That tracks, I think, with our thinking on neuroplasticity in terms of the fact that after someone has a stroke, you end up in this window of enhanced neuroplasticity for the first few months after the stroke. And those patients seem to make gains quite quickly, probably because they've got some molecular changes going on that allow them to do so. And so my expectation would be that you start applying some of these novel treatments like RTMS early on, we may have the opportunity to get a bigger bang for our buck, so to speak, with the therapy when we apply it in that subacute time period.
Excellent. I'm certainly looking forward to future large-scale trials that could hopefully eventually lead this to be something that's widely adopted to help our patients. And earlier you also mentioned revisiting medications as a possible venue or avenue to help our stroke patients. And you also highlighted a trial that you're part of studying the drug Maravrac. I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit more details on it.
Sure. It's a 120 patient phase 2 trial. As of this week, we had 51 patients recruited into it, and it's an inpatient study. So we start this drug between 5 days and 8 weeks post-stroke. The patients are on the drug 300 milligrams twice a day for a period of 8 weeks. They go through their usual rehabilitation in Canada, in which case people would be transferred from an acute stroke unit to a rehab unit, typically around 7 to 10 days post-stroke, and they'd spend anywhere from about 30 to 42 days in inpatient rehab. And in addition to that, they do some extra exercise for an hour a day outside of the usual care that they're receiving. And we monitor them at baseline, 4 weeks into the study, 8 weeks into the study, and then 6 months. And our expectation is that the group that's taking the drug will have better motor outcomes for the upper extremity as measured by the Fecal-Meyer, and for the lower extremity as measured by the 10-meter walk test. And we got into this trial because of work that came with Carmichael's group at UCLA, looking at blocking the CCR5 receptor with Maraviroc, and in animal models, showing that they had a substantially better motor recovery if CCR5 was blocked after a stroke. And then through some observational studies, a study called the Tabasco trial, because in rare cases, you can see patients who are born without the CCR5 receptor. And those patients after stroke in this prospective observational study had much better balance and much better walking when they followed them. And so we've got a couple lines of evidence leading into the trial. The trial itself, again, is early, it's phase 2, but we're multi-site across Canada doing this trial. And so we'll see how it works out.
Excellent. I'm hopeful, and I'm also excited to hear that there are different modalities that are promising for the future of stroke rehab. And especially in the past, we have had mixed results with medications like SSRIs. So I'm hoping we get some really positive results from these exciting trials. And looking ahead, what do you see are some of the most important directions for future research in your field?
Well, it's an exciting time to be in the field because we've got a lot of things that are actually going on. I think the most important thing that we do over the next 10 years is bring the concept of precision neurorehabilitation to stroke. And that's the idea that stroke affects people differently. And, in some cases, we can see what looks like the same lesion on an MRI or CT in a brain, and the two patients have different outcomes. And anecdotally, I think that's probably because the brain organizes itself in a different way for different people after the stroke. And part of that's based on their experiences after the stroke and maybe also their experiences before the stroke, and adds a lot of heterogeneity to our study. But there's some things that can help us try to figure out what puts the patient in the right therapy at the right time. There's work being done on biomarkers to try to work out how we might be able to personalize the rehab treatments that we do. There's work being done on better assessment tools, robotics, wearable sensors to try to improve the types of treatments that we deliver. And so I think there's a lot that we have to unpack to get to precision neurorehab, but providing, a therapy that's very specific to the patient that's in front of you and the neurologic impairment disability they have and the change in the brain and their brain networks that we have is a place that we need to go over the next decade in stroke rehabilitation.
I'm really excited to see that leaders and researchers like you are at the forefront of this, and I'm excited for the future. And thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insight. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
That was Dr. Sean Dukelow of the University of Calgary, interviewed by Dr. Cheran Elangovan of the University of Tennessee Health Science Center. ANA Investigates is the official podcast of the American Neurological Association. The show's producers are members of the ANA Education Innovation Committee, chaired by Sarah Nelson and Cheran Elangovan. I'm Adeline Goss, podcast host and executive producer. Our production team this month included Cheran Elangovan and Jen Hurley. You can listen to past episodes of the show, subscribe to us so you never miss an episode, and access all of the ANA's educational programs on the Education tab at myana.org. That's it for ANA Investigates. See you next month.